Welcome back. Patrick Lovell is here with me to explain in segment by segment so that you can walk away. Everybody can understand so much better the corruption in our financial system, much of which still exists, much of which still sets us up for absolute economic disaster and exploitation by fraudsters who put their millions and millions of dollars in their pocket and benefit from their fraud without any civil or criminal accountability, leaving everybody else to suffer the consequences. Patrick, tell us, if you would, what you believe the major factors were that happened in the lead up to the economic disaster in 2008, and especially from a political point of view, taking into account the revolving door of from these financial institutions to regulation, back to the financial institutions, the people who benefited, and the kind of chicanery that these politicians, what they were up to in putting our nation at so much greater risk and ultimately leading to the 2008 economic meltdown.
Well, I appreciate you saying off the top, Rocky, that a lot of what took place in 2008 is not ancient history by any means. It's happening now, and it never stopped because of what didn't happen as a result of what we're going to tell you. So really going back to that time period, the most critical time period, Rocky, was really during the Clinton administration. We call it the 3Ds. It was deregulation, desupervision, and decriminalization. Now, what does that mean for the layman? Well, that means that they basically got rid of laws and accountability for a financial structure that, if you understood the massive sort of opportunity to create fees from illegal behavior without any accountability, is what took place. And it starts with getting rid of a Depression-era regulation known as Glass-Steagall.
And Glass-Steagall was passed during the Depression to protect against further destruction of our economy.
Absolutely.
Correct?
It came as a result of the Great Depression. They did investigations and they came up with the laws where they realized they actually looked and they found solutions to problems that created the Great Depression.
And it basically, Glass-Steagall basically prohibits the centralized ownership of commercial banks, investment banks, and insurance companies, right?
Absolutely.
And led by Bill Clinton and his Treasury Secretary, Robert Rubin, who had been co-chair of the board of Goldman Sachs, who had so much to benefit from all this, they got Congress to go along with doing what in regard to Glass-Steagall?
Well, they defanged it. They got rid of the separation between commercial banking and speculation, quite frankly. And so they were able to use kind of a smoke and mirrors tactic on top of another regulation or deregulation that took place at that time called the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. Now, like you said so poignantly, that Robert Rubin was the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, who then became the Treasury Secretary under President Clinton, and he had the whole financial sort of, let's say, agenda at the apex of what they were trying to achieve, which was to create, I think from a political apparatus, home ownership affordable for all of America, right? Sounds perfect from a campaign standpoint, but if you don't understand the apparatus of financialization and lending and ultimately how that could lead into derivatives, then you don't see the full picture of how this ultimately created a train wreck of the global economy.
And this other legislation we're talking about basically deregulated derivatives,
Absolutely.
correct? The kinds of instruments that led to the economic meltdown and then led to this massive multi-trillion-dollar bailout by the United States government of the very financial institutions that brought all this about.
All built on deception and fraud and an engineering that was so massive it had never happened before in history.
Okay, so Robert Rubin comes in as Clinton's Treasury Secretary. Clinton goes along with him. They get rid of Glass-Steagall. They get rid of the regulation of these securities instruments, the speculative, what turned out to be toxic derivatives. What happened to Robert Rubin? When we talk about the revolving door between Washington, D.C. and the financial institutions. What happened to Robert Rubin after he left the Clinton administration, which did these massive favors for Wall Street?
It's one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of the United States, and it's on display in the con. Robert Rubin effectively walked with $120 million for basically making sure the government did not bring criminal prosecutions against this massive fraud that we have evidence of that ultimately led to trillions in bailouts for the people that were doing it, or the banks that were actually doing it.
So he was one of the heads at Goldman,
Yep.
came in as Treasury Secretary, got Clinton and Congress to basically deregulate all of this, to let the financial sector make huge amounts of money, engaging in these horribly corrupt, fraudulent, enormously reckless practices. And then he went out of government, Robert Rubin, to Citigroup.
Yep.
And what I read was somewhere around $116 million of compensation and stock options.
Absolutely, by ignoring the warnings that came internally from whistleblowers that we have in the con. I mean, it was extraordinary. Not only did he set the whole thing up in terms of policy, like you mentioned, but literally understood the details of the largest criminal conspiracy that was happening underneath the leadership of Citi, of which, of course, he became named the chair of. And
All
so
right.
ultimately, he's at the apex of that.
So we've gone about 2.5 minutes beyond what we were shooting for. We really are shooting to make these no more than 3 or 4 minutes long, but it's worth the time because you can read book after book on this, spend hundreds of hours studying it, and I don't think anybody's going to come away with a better understanding of what it is that led to this tragedy in 2008 and the circumstances that are still in place for further economic tragedy and exploitation, especially of working people, people with pensions, and people who are at risk of losing their homes. You, the viewers, will end up knowing far more. And we're trying to simplify it. We're trying to put this in very direct terms for you. So please stay tuned for the third segment of Patrick Lovell talking about what's also described in the tremendous docuseries that he's put together, The Con. And ultimately, we are going to be talking about solutions because none of us, it gets so frustrating talking about problems, what's happened in the past, without talking about you, what you and we, all of us, as we the people, can do to change the course of what our government is doing when we see so much corruption and our politicians doing whatever's in the interest of their campaign contributors and those who can pay for their expensive lobbyists at the expense of the public interest.